For nearly a century, school textbooks and popular culture have repeated a single, convenient story about the greatest economic catastrophe in modern history. That on a single catastrophic Tuesday in October 1929, Wall Street suddenly lost its mind, speculative greed collided with reality, and the stock market crash plunged the entire planet into the Great Depression. But this story is fundamentally incomplete, and historically, it is wrong. The Great Depression was not created in the roaring trading pits of the New York Stock Exchange on Black Tuesday. It was engineered years earlier in the private drawing rooms and secret transatlantic meetings of central bankers trying to resurrect a dying imperial currency. Behind the black and white photographs of soup kitchens and desperate ticker-tape traders lies a far darker and more intricate financial conspiracy of policy failure, imperial vanity, and deliberate monetary sabotage. The true architects of the catastrophe were not rogue stock manipulators, but four powerful central bankers who held the fate of global finance in their hands. Montagu Norman, the eccentric and secretive governor of the Bank of England. Benjamin Strong, the brilliant and dominant governor of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Hjalmar Schacht, the austere president of the German Reichsbank, and Charles Rist of the Bank of France. Their secret decisions: a disastrous British monetary decree in 1925, an unpublicized Long Island conclave in 1927 that intentionally flooded Wall Street with cheap credit, the sudden power vacuum caused by an untimely death in 1928, the deliberate refusal to rescue an immigrant-owned commercial bank in 1930, and an ideological embrace of economic liquidationism, are what actually turned a routine cyclical downturn into a decade of worldwide ruin. Most people assume the disaster began when the opening bell rang at 11 Wall Street on October 24, 1929, but the true origin of the Great Depression starts 4 years earlier and 3,000 miles away, inside the neoclassical halls of the British Treasury in London. To understand why American breadlines formed in 1932, one must first understand the fatal monetary blunder committed by the British Empire in the spring of 1925. To understand why the British establishment was so fanatically committed to restoring the pre-war gold parity in 1925, one must examine the recommendations of the Cunliffe Committee, appointed by the British government in 1918 and chaired by Lord Cunliffe, former governor of the Bank of England. The committee concluded that London's global financial supremacy, the international prestige of the City of London as the world's premier clearinghouse, and the continued dominance of sterling as the global trade currency depended entirely upon an immediate, uncompromising return to gold at $4.86. British banking elites viewed any devaluation of sterling as a shameful, imperial admission of defeat to the United States, choosing to sacrifice domestic British industry and industrial employment on the altar of international financial prestige. The structural fragility of the interwar monetary system was further worsened by the creation of the gold exchange standard at the Genoa Economic Conference of 1922. Recognizing that global gold production had failed to keep pace with the massive expansion of post-war international trade and government debt, international central bankers devised a dangerous compromise. Smaller nations were encouraged to hold their official central bank reserves not in physical gold bullion, but in interest-bearing foreign currencies, specifically British pound sterling and United States dollars. This created an inverted, highly leveraged pyramid of global credit. Central banks in Austria, Germany, Poland, and South America issued domestic paper currencies backed by sterling deposits in London, while the Bank of England held only fractional physical gold reserves to back its foreign liabilities. The entire global monetary architecture rested upon a fragile foundation of confidence that would instantly disintegrate the moment foreign central banks attempted to convert their paper sterling into physical gold. In April 1925, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, a young and ambitious Winston Churchill who possessed little formal training in economics, made the most disastrous policy decision of his political career. He announced that Great Britain would return the British pound sterling to the international gold standard at its pre-World War I parity of $4.86. During the 4 grueling years of the First World War, Britain had printed hundreds of millions of paper pounds to finance artillery shells, naval blockades, and Allied subsidies, causing domestic prices to surge and permanently eroding the purchasing power of sterling. By returning to gold at the historic Victorian rate, Churchill artificially overvalued the British pound by at least 10%. The legendary British economist John Maynard Keynes immediately published a scathing, prophetic pamphlet titled The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, warning that this artificial overvaluation would act as a devastating 10% tax on all British exports, forcing coal mines, textile mills, and shipyards to slash workers' wages to remain competitive in global markets. Keynes's prediction materialized with brutal precision. British export industries collapsed, unemployment soared past 10%, and in May 1926, over 1 million British coal miners and transport workers launched the historic general strike, paralyzing the United Kingdom. More critically for the global financial system, international investors and currency traders began steadily converting their overvalued pounds into gold, draining the vaults of the Bank of England on Threadneedle Street and threatening the British Empire with sovereign currency insolvency. Desperate to halt the catastrophic bleeding of gold from London, the governor of the Bank of England, Montagu Norman, a brooding, mysterious figure who traveled under the alias Professor Clarence Skinner and consulted spiritual mediums, realized that Britain could not survive unless interest rates in the United States were deliberately manipulated. If interest rates in New York were higher than in London, capital and gold would naturally flow across the Atlantic into American banks. Norman needed the United States to lower its interest rates, make American credit artificially cheap, and encourage investors to move their money to London. Simultaneously, across the English Channel, an equally disruptive monetary development was unfolding in France. In 1926, French Premier Raymond Poincaré stabilized the French franc following years of post-war inflation. But unlike Churchill, Poincaré pegged the franc at an artificially undervalued exchange rate, roughly one-fifth of its pre-war value. This undervalued Poincaré franc transformed France into a massive export powerhouse, generating enormous trade surpluses. Under the conservative direction of the Bank of France, led by Governor Émile Moreau and economic advisor Charles Rist, France enacted a deliberate policy of demanding settlement of its foreign claims exclusively in physical gold bullion. Between 1927 and 1931, the Bank of France drained hundreds of millions of dollars in gold from London and New York, accumulating nearly 1/4 of the world's total monetary gold in its subterranean vaults beneath the Rue de la Villiers in Paris, starving the rest of the international banking system of vital liquidity. Most people and even many conventional historians completely miss this critical turning point. The roaring speculative bubble of the late 1920s was not an organic product of American capitalism, but the direct result of a secret central bank bailout designed to rescue the British pound. In July 1927, Montagu Norman traveled covertly to the United States aboard an ocean liner, avoiding Washington and arriving at the private country estate of Benjamin Strong in Glen Cove, Long Island. Joining them were H. Hjalmar Schacht of the German Reichsbank and Charles Rist of the Bank of France. Behind locked doors in Long Island, Norman pleaded for an emergency monetary intervention. Benjamin Strong, who shared a deep personal friendship with Norman and believed that international financial stability depended upon the survival of the gold standard in Europe, agreed to execute what he casually described to his colleagues as a little coup de whiskey to the stock market. In August 1927, under Strong's commanding leadership, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York slashed its benchmark rediscount rate from 4% to 3.5% and purchased hundreds of millions of dollars in United States government securities through open market operations. This aggressive, coordinated monetary easing achieved its immediate diplomatic objective. Gold stopped leaving London, and the Bank of England was temporarily rescued from insolvency. But the flood of cheap, artificial credit injected into the American financial system had nowhere to go in an already mature industrial economy. Instead of funding new factories or agricultural equipment, this torrent of high-powered money flowed directly into the New York financial markets, sparking the most frenzied, speculative stock market frenzy in human history. Between late 1927 and the autumn of 1929, Wall Street transformed into a speculative casino fueled by unregulated margin debt. Commercial banks across the United States, flush with cheap Federal Reserve reserves, lent billions of dollars to brokerage houses in the form of broker loans. Ordinary citizens, dentists, clerks, and shopkeepers were encouraged to buy common stocks on 10% margin, meaning that an investor needed only $1,000 in cash to purchase $10,000 worth of shares in Radio Corporation of America, General Motors, or Montgomery Ward, borrowing the remaining 90% from Wall Street brokers. By early 1929, broker loans had exploded to over $8 billion, with daily trading volumes overwhelming the mechanical ticker tape machines at the New York Stock Exchange. The global financial ecosystem of the late 1920s was trapped in a precarious, circular debt carousel engineered by Wall Street investment banking syndicates, led by J.P. Morgan and Company. Under the 1924 Dawes Plan and the 1929 Young Plan, American private investors purchased billions of dollars in German government and municipal bonds. The German Weimar Republic used this borrowed American capital to pay annual First World War reparations to Great Britain and France, who in turn used those exact same funds to service their wartime inter-allied debt payments back to the United States Treasury in Washington. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates in 1928, and American investors abandoned foreign bonds to speculate in the booming New York stock market, this multi-billion-dollar international debt carousel instantly ground to a halt, cutting Germany off from foreign credit and driving German industrial unemployment into a catastrophic upward spiral. Then, in October 1928, the delicate machinery of central banking suffered an irreparable catastrophe. Benjamin Strong died suddenly at the age of 55 from complications of tuberculosis. Strong had been the undisputed intellectual and operational master of the Federal Reserve System, the only central banker with the prestige, independence, and vision to manage complex open market operations. His death created a paralyzing institutional civil war inside the Federal Reserve System. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, now led by George L. Harrison, advocated for swift, decisive interest rate adjustments to gently deflate the speculative bubble. However, the conservative Federal Reserve Board in Washington, chaired by Roy A. Young and dominated by the rigid, dogmatic economist Adolph C. Miller, bitterly opposed the New York Fed, refusing to coordinate monetary policy and insisting that stock speculation was a moral failing that state banking regulators should police through administrative jobbing. Paralyzed by bureaucratic infighting throughout 1928 and early 1929, the Federal Reserve Board finally panicked in the summer of 1929, hiking the rediscount rate aggressively to 6% in August. This abrupt, severe monetary tightening was like slamming the brakes on a locomotive traveling at full speed. Because the United States was the primary creditor nation funding post-war reconstruction in Europe and Latin America, the sudden spike in American interest rates instantly choked off international capital flows to Germany, Austria, and South America. Industrial production in the United States peaked in June 1929 and began contracting sharply in July and August, months before the stock market took notice. Here is the second major historical reality that popular mythology obscures. The stock market crash of October 1929 did not cause the Great Depression. It was merely the financial symptom of an industrial contraction that was already well underway due to the Federal Reserve's sudden credit contraction. When panic finally struck the trading floor on Black Thursday, October 24, and Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929, wiping out over $30 billion in nominal paper wealth in less than a week, the United States economy experienced a severe, painful financial shock. Yet, as economic historians Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz proved in their monumental research, A Monetary History of the United States, the stock crash alone would have produced only a standard, severe cyclical recession, comparable to the sharp but brief post-war depression of 1920 to 1921, had the Federal Reserve not committed a catastrophic series of unforced monetary errors between 1930 and 1933. Throughout 1930, As retail sales fell and businesses laid off workers, the United States banking system began to exhibit severe structural fractures. The nation possessed over 24,000 small, unit banks, most of them rural institutions with undiversified loan portfolios heavily concentrated in agriculture and local real estate. In the autumn of 1930, severe agricultural droughts in the Mississippi Valley caused widespread farm loan defaults, triggering a wave of rural bank runs across Missouri, Indiana, Illinois, and Tennessee, culminating in the November 1930 collapse of Caldwell and Company in Nashville, the largest financial syndicate in the American South. The localized banking panic metastasized into a systemic national crisis on the morning of Thursday, December 11, 1930, in New York City, with the failure of the Bank of United States. Despite its official-sounding name, the Bank of United States was a private, state-chartered commercial bank with 60 branches, 400,000 depositors, and over $200 million in deposits, serving primarily Jewish immigrant garment manufacturers, merchants, and small shopkeepers in the Lower East Side, Brooklyn, and the Bronx. When rumors of financial difficulties spread, thousands of frantic depositors formed massive, block-long queues in the freezing December rain to withdraw their life savings. The superintendent of banks of the state of New York, Joseph Broderick, pleaded with the aristocratic leadership of the New York Clearing House Association and the Federal Reserve Bank of New York to organize a joint $30 million liquidity guarantee to keep the bank open, pointing out that the bank possessed sound assets and that its failure would shatter public confidence in the entire American banking system. But the elite Wall Street bankers, led by representatives of traditional Anglo-Saxon financial dynasties who viewed the immigrant-owned institution with thinly veiled prejudice, refused to contribute a single dollar. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, abandoning Benjamin Strong's tradition of decisive lender of last resort intervention, stood passively aside and allowed the Bank of United States to close its doors. It was the largest commercial bank failure in American history up to that date, triggering a devastating wave of nationwide panic that led millions of citizens to withdraw their paper currency from commercial banks and hoard physical gold and cash in mattresses and safe deposit boxes. Rather than flooding the distressed banking system with emergency liquidity as central banking doctrine, since Walter Bagehot demanded, the leadership of the Federal Reserve embraced a toxic, pseudoscientific economic ideology known as the real bills doctrine and the cruel philosophy of liquidationism. In Washington, the octogenarian Secretary of the Treasury, the Pittsburgh banking and aluminum baron Andrew Mellon, advised President Herbert Hoover to let the economy collapse completely. Mellon famously delivered his brutal prescription: liquidate labor, liquidate stocks, liquidate the farmers, liquidate real estate. It will purge the rottenness out of the system. High costs of living and high living will come down. People will work harder, live a more moral life. Values will be adjusted, and enterprising people will pick up from less competent people. Guided by this liquidationist dogma, the Federal Reserve Board deliberately refused to conduct open market bond purchases to offset the contraction of the money supply. When banks failed, their deposits vanished from circulation. Between 1929 and 1933, over 9,000 American commercial banks collapsed, wiping out billions of dollars in personal savings. The total money supply of the United States contracted by an astonishing 31%. 1 out of every $3 circulating in the American economy simply ceased to exist. Because money had become scarce, the price of goods, services, and labor plummeted by 33% in a catastrophic deflationary spiral. Farmers who had borrowed money to purchase tractors in 1928 found that the bushel of wheat they sold for $1.40 in 1929 now fetched barely 30 cents in 1932, while their mortgage debt remained fixed in nominal terms, leading to the foreclosure of hundreds of thousands of family farms across the Great Plains. The systemic corruption and reckless practices of Wall Street commercial banks were laid bare between 1932 and 1934 during the explosive hearings of the Senate Banking Committee, famously known as the Pecora Commission, led by relentless Chief Counsel Ferdinand Pecora. Pecora's forensic cross-examination revealed that the nation's largest financial institutions, led by Charles E. Mitchell, the charismatic president of the National City Bank of New York, universally known as Sunshine Charlie, had transformed commercial banks into aggressive retail boiler rooms, unloading toxic, uncollectible Latin American bonds and worthless corporate securities onto unsuspecting retail depositors. Pecora revealed that J.P. Morgan and Company maintained secret, preferred lists of influential political figures, including former President Calvin Coolidge, Supreme Court justices, cabinet secretaries, and party bosses, allowing them to purchase high-flying stock initial public offerings at deep discounts before they were marketed to the public. In the spring of 1931, the financial contagion that had been brewing in America crossed the Atlantic and detonated across Europe. In May 1931, the largest and most prestigious private commercial bank in Austria, the Kreditanstalt in Vienna, founded by the Rothschild family in 1855, collapsed under the weight of bad industrial loans and the sudden withdrawal of foreign short-term deposits. The Austrian government attempted to guarantee the bank's debts, but the panic spread instantly to the Weimar Republic, where major German institutions, led by the Darmstädter und Nationalbank, suffered massive liquidity runs. In July 1931, the German government was forced to declare a national bank holiday, suspend all international debt payments, and impose strict exchange controls. The German financial collapse triggered an immediate, existential run on London. Foreign investors, terrified that European banks were disintegrating, began dumping British pounds and demanding physical gold bullion from the Bank of England at an alarming rate of millions of pounds per day. On September 21, 1931, having exhausted its gold reserves and emergency loans from Wall Street and Paris, Great Britain formally abandoned the gold standard, devaluing the pound sterling and destroying the international monetary architecture that had anchored global commerce for 2 centuries. Over 25 nations followed Britain off gold within months, erecting retaliatory trade tariffs, currency devaluations, and import quotas that dismantled global trade. In the United States, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of June 1930, signed by President Hoover despite a petition signed by over 1,000 American economists, begging for a veto, raised import tariffs on over 20,000 manufactured and agricultural products to historic levels exceeding 50%. America's trading partners immediately retaliated with punitive tariffs against American wheat, automobiles, and machinery. Between 1929 and 1933, the total value of world trade collapsed by 66%, shrinking from $36 billion to barely $12 billion, choking off the last remaining avenue of global economic recovery. By the freezing winter of 1932 and 1933, the American economy had reached absolute rock bottom. National income had been cut in half. Over 15 million American workers, 1 out of every 4 able-bodied breadwinners, were completely unemployed. In industrial cities like Detroit, Chicago, and Cleveland, unemployment exceeded 50%. Because there was no federal unemployment insurance, food stamps, or Social Security, millions of families were evicted from their apartments and homes, congregating in squalid shantytowns constructed of corrugated tin, tar paper, and wooden crates on the edges of every major city, bitterly named Hoovervilles. Millions of destitute men, women, and teenagers hopped freight trains, roaming the countryside in search of casual agricultural labor, while in the American heartland, severe agricultural erosion and record heat waves generated the terrifying black dust blizzards of the Dust Bowl. The final, definitive collapse of the American banking system occurred in the winter of 1933, during the interregnum between the defeat of Herbert Hoover and the inauguration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. By February 1933, bank panics had spread to every state in the Union, forcing the governors of Michigan, Maryland, and 40 other states to declare statewide banking holidays to prevent depositors from emptying bank vaults. On March 6, 1933, 36 hours after taking the presidential oath of office, President Roosevelt invoked the First World War Trading with the Enemy Act to declare a 4-day national bank holiday, shutting down every bank in the United States. In April 1933, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 6102, criminalizing the private hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion and gold certificates, requiring all American citizens to surrender their physical gold to the Federal Reserve under threat of a $10,000 fine and 10 years in federal prison, permanently severing the domestic link between the United States dollar and physical gold. To rebuild the shattered remnants of the American financial system from the ground up, Congress passed the Landmark Banking Act of June 1933, universally known as the Glass-Steagall Act, sponsored by Virginia Senator Carter Glass and Alabama Representative Henry Steagall. The legislation enacted a strict, mandatory wall of separation between conservative commercial banks that accepted public deposits and aggressive Wall Street investment banks that underwrote corporate stocks and bonds, prohibiting commercial institutions from risking their depositors' money in stock market speculation. More importantly, the act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, providing a direct federal government guarantee on individual bank deposits up to $2,500. The psychological impact of deposit insurance was immediate and miraculous. The moment ordinary American citizens realized that their personal savings were directly backed by the full faith and credit of the United States Treasury, the devastating bank runs that had destroyed 9,000 institutions ceased virtually overnight, proving that financial panics were structural design flaws rather than unavoidable natural phenomena. The final, international burial of the interwar gold standard occurred in the Grand Geological Museum in London during the World Economic Conference of June and July 1933. Delegations from 66 nations assembled in London to negotiate an emergency stabilization agreement that would fix global exchange rates and halt the destructive cycle of competitive currency devaluations. However, on July 3, 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt transmitted his famous bombshell message across the Atlantic, fiercely rejecting any international agreement to peg the dollar. Roosevelt declared that the United States would refuse to sacrifice domestic price recovery and the restoration of American employment on the altar of artificial international exchange rates, effectively torpedoing the conference and signaling to the world that the era of Victorian imperial central banking was dead. This brings us to the third crucial revelation that conventional accounts overlook. The Federal Reserve possessed the legal authority, the gold reserves, and the institutional tools to stop the Great Depression at any moment between 1930 and 1932 by executing massive open market purchases of government bonds, yet it deliberately chose inaction. In his landmark historical address in 2002, celebrating Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, Federal Reserve Governor Ben Bernanke, who would later navigate the 2008 financial crisis as Fed chairman, stated the historical truth plainly and unequivocally on behalf of the central bank. Let me say to Milton and Anna regarding the Great Depression, "You're right, we did it. We're very sorry, but thanks to you we won't do it again." The structural patterns that engineered the Great Depression in the 1920s and 1930s bear an alarming, unmistakable parallel to the monetary landscape of the 21st century. For over a decade following the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2020 pandemic, major global central banks, led by the Federal Reserve, the European Central Bank, and the Bank of Japan, flooded the international financial architecture with trillions of dollars in quantitative easing and maintained interest rates pinned at artificial near-zero levels. Just like the secret Long Island rate cuts of 1927, this prolonged era of ultra-cheap money subsidized sovereign government deficits and inflated historic asset bubbles in real estate, equities, and private debt. And when central banks were forced to rapidly tighten monetary policy to combat inflation, the sudden withdrawal of liquidity once again exposed the systemic fragility of modern commercial banking, reminding us that when monetary authorities manipulate the price of credit to serve short-term geopolitical and sovereign debt objectives, the inevitable reckoning is simply delayed and magnified. Behind the cold statistical graphs of GDP contraction and bank closure ratios lies an immense, heartbreaking tapestry of human suffering that permanently scarred an entire generation. In the bitter winter of 1932, in the shadow of Wall Street skyscrapers, dignified men in worn woolen overcoats stood in breadlines 4 blocks long, waiting for hours in freezing sleet for a single cup of thin broth and a crust of stale bread. In the coal mining towns of West Virginia and Pennsylvania, children went to school barefoot in the snow, taking turns wearing a single pair of shared boots, while their fathers sat idle outside padlocked pitheads. In Iowa and Nebraska, proud third-generation farming families wept silently on their front porches as county sheriffs auctioned off their ancestral land, tractors, and livestock for pennies on the dollar at distress penny auctions. The psychological trauma of losing one's life savings, not to personal failure or lack of work ethic, but to the invisible, arbitrary collapse of a banking system they trusted, eroded the faith of an entire civilization in the institutions of liberal democracy, opening the dark geopolitical path toward radicalization, fascism, and the catastrophic carnage of the Second World War. The ultimate philosophical lesson of the Great Depression is that modern economic catastrophes are almost never the result of sudden, uncontrollable acts of nature or irrational public panics. They are the cumulative, inevitable consequence of policy arrogance and institutional vanity among elite technocrats who believe they can artificially manipulate the fundamental laws of money without paying the price. When central bankers attempt to preserve obsolete imperial parities or rescue foreign bond markets by distorting domestic credit, they do not eliminate risk. They merely accumulate systemic imbalances until the entire monetary edifice collapses under its own weight. So when popular history tells you that the Great Depression began on Black Tuesday in October 1929, because greedy Wall Street investors gambled away the nation's wealth, remember the deeper, documented truth. The crash in New York was merely the final, dramatic cracking of a foundation that had been fatally compromised in 1925, when London returned to an overvalued gold parity. Accelerated in 1927, when central bankers met in secret on Long Island to flood the world with cheap money, and sealed between 1930 and 1933, when a paralyzed Federal Reserve stood by and allowed the nation's money supply to implode. If you want to understand the hidden financial ledgers, banking secrets, and economic forces that truly shape human history, subscribe to Chrono. Hit the like button to help this documentary reach more thoughtful viewers, and let me know in the comments below. Do you believe modern central banks have genuinely learned the fatal lessons of the 1930s? Or are we currently living through the exact same monetary cycle of artificial credit expansion and inevitable collapse?